It was a bright, sunny afternoon, and the house was filled with warmth as the sun's rays streamed through the windows. Inside, everything seemed peaceful, almost too peaceful. In the corner of the living room, a fluffy little kitten named Whiskers was playing with a ball of yarn, her tiny paws batting it around with joy. Her playful meows filled the air as she darted back and forth, chasing her toy in circles. Whiskers had only been part of the family for a few weeks, but already she had brought so much happiness into the home. Her soft fur and innocent blue eyes made everyone smile. She loved to explore every nook and cranny of the house, always getting into things she probably shouldn't. But today, her curiosity was about to take her on an adventure that would change everything. In the kitchen, Sarah, Whiskers' owner, was busy preparing dinner. She hummed softly to herself, chopping vegetables for the meal. It was just another ordinary evening in their little home. But little did Sarah know, a disaster was quietly unfolding in the next room. Whiskers had grown tired of her yarn, and now found herself in a much more dangerous part of the house, the kitchen. The smell of food was tempting, but what really caught her attention was something much more intriguing. On the kitchen counter sat a small lit candle, glowing softly in the dim light of the room. It was placed there just moments before by Sarah, who had been setting a cozy mood for dinner. The flickering flame caught Whiskers' attention immediately. The kitten's tiny paws patted across the cold tile floor as she padded toward the counter, her wide eyes fixed on the flickering light. She was so small, and yet her curiosity was as big as the world. Whiskers jumped up on the counter with ease, her fluffy tail trailing behind her. She stood tall, her eyes glued to the candle, its warm glow casting shadows on the walls. Without hesitation, she stretched her little paw toward the candle. Whiskers was not yet aware of the danger. She had no idea that this little flame could cause so much harm. But to her, it was just another thing to explore. She batted at it gently with her tiny paw. The candle wobbled, tipping slightly to the side. Just as Whiskers was about to play with the candle again, something unexpected happened. The candle tipped too far. The flame that had once been harmless now began to move, leaning dangerously close to the kitchen towel that Sarah had carelessly left on the counter. The fabric, dry from being folded earlier, was now at the perfect distance to catch the flame. The first puff of smoke was almost unnoticeable, a tiny wisp rising up from the towel. But as the seconds passed, the smoke grew thicker, and the flickering flame began to consume the towel faster. Whiskers, oblivious to the danger she had just triggered, continued to bat at the candle, pushing it even further. Suddenly, the first spark of flame appeared on the towel. It spread slowly at first, just a little puff of smoke, but then the fire grew quickly. Whiskers, startled by the change, backed up a few steps, her wide eyes now noticing the smoke curling in the air. The kitchen began to fill with the scent of something burning. It was the kind of smell that immediately put you on edge. The fire on the towel began to spread quickly to the curtains nearby. Whiskers scampered across the counter in confusion, her tiny legs racing to find safety. She mewed in panic, but the flames were now getting larger, and she couldn't escape the heat. The once calm and cozy kitchen had turned into a dangerous zone, all because of one curious kitten. Meanwhile, Sarah was still in the other room, folding laundry and singing quietly. She hadn't noticed the rising smoke or the fire that had already begun to spread. Whiskers' small cries went unheard in the chaos of the house. The kitchen was filling with smoke now, and the flames were starting to lick at the curtains, turning them a dark shade of red as they began to catch fire. As the smoke thickened and the fire spread, Whiskers was left alone in the kitchen, completely unaware of the disaster she had just caused. The innocent game with the candle had quickly turned into something far more dangerous, and now the house was on the brink of being consumed by the flames. But still, no one knew the danger that was unfolding right under Sarah's nose. The clock was ticking, and the fire was spreading rapidly, but there was still time to act. Would Sarah make it in time to save her beloved kitten and her home? The smoke in the kitchen was thick, filling the air with a suffocating, burning smell. Whiskers' tiny paws scrambled across the countertop, her big, innocent eyes wide with confusion and fear. The flames now spread along the kitchen towel, their bright orange glow reflecting in the kitten's terrified gaze. She knew, a small, helpless sound that was drowned out by the crackling of the fire. In the next room, Sarah was folding laundry, completely unaware that the house was now in danger. The soft sound of fabric rustling was the only noise she heard. But then something shifted in the air, a subtle change that caused her to pause. Sarah frowned, sniffing the air. The faint smell of something burning seemed to linger just at the edge of her awareness. She looked up from her laundry basket, a sense of unease creeping over her. It was a strange feeling, like something wasn't quite right. She stood still for a moment, listening carefully, and then she heard it. A faint crackling sound, like a fire starting to grow. Her heart skipped a beat. The first thought that flashed through her mind was the candle she had left on the kitchen counter, but she quickly dismissed it. No, she thought, there was no way. But the smell was growing stronger. The air felt thick. Sarah dropped the laundry and hurried toward the kitchen, her footsteps quick and urgent. Her pulse raced as she rounded the corner and stepped into the kitchen. The sight that greeted her was something she couldn't believe. The kitchen was shrouded in a thick cloud of smoke. The faint, warm light of the candle now seemed almost like a distant memory, replaced by the ominous flicker of flames. The fire had already spread across the kitchen towel and was now working its way up the side of the cabinets. Whiskers, startled and confused, was still on the counter, but she was no longer batting at the candle. Instead, she backed away from the heat, her fur puffed up in fear, her tiny mews echoing in the smoke-filled room. Whiskers! Sarah gasped, her eyes wide in horror. She rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She quickly grabbed the nearest towel and tried to smother the flames, but it was no use. The fire was too strong, too fast. It licked its way up the curtains and across the kitchen, spreading with terrifying speed. Panic rose in Sarah's chest as she realized just how out of control the situation had become. The flames were spreading toward the wooden cabinets and the stove. The kitchen, once a warm and welcoming place, was now a battleground between fire and safety. Sarah knew she had only seconds to act before the fire could spread beyond repair. "Whiskers, come here," she shouted desperately, her voice filled with fear. But the kitten, paralyzed by the rising heat, didn't move. Sarah was torn between saving her home and saving her kitten. She glanced at the flames, which seemed to grow taller by the second, then back at Whiskers. Time was slipping away. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed Whiskers from the counter and held her tightly in her arms. The kitten struggled for a moment, clearly scared by the smoke and the heat, but Sarah didn't let go. She held onto her precious pet, determined to get them both to safety. The fire was getting worse. Sarah ran toward the door, clutching Whiskers close to her chest. She had to get out, had to get somewhere safe. The thought of her home being destroyed, everything she worked so hard to build, flashed through her mind. But the only thing that mattered right now was getting Whiskers out of harm's way. As Sarah reached the front door, she felt the heat growing more intense, the smoke suffocating her lungs. She pushed open the door and stepped outside, gasping for the cool, fresh air. She stumbled onto the porch, holding Whiskers tightly, her heart racing as she watched the smoke billow from the open kitchen window. She didn't stop to look back. She ran down the steps, holding Whiskers in her arms as the kitten trembled. She only stopped when she reached the front yard, the cool evening air filling her lungs, and she could finally breathe again. Sarah collapsed to her knees, tears stinging her eyes as she hugged Whiskers close to her chest. The kitten, still shaking, mewed softly, nuzzling into Sarah's arms for comfort. They were safe, but the house, the place they had once called home, was still behind them, engulfed in smoke and flames. Sarah could only watch in shock as neighbors began to pour out of their homes, some already on their phones calling the fire department. The fire had already caused so much damage, but for now, the most important thing was that Sarah and Whiskers were alive. But as she sat there, holding her trembling kitten. Sarah couldn't help but wonder, would they ever be able to go back home? The night air was cold, but Sarah barely noticed. Her heart was still racing, her hands trembling as she cradled Whiskers in her arms. The kitten, usually so full of energy and curiosity, was now silent, her little body shaking from the shock. Sarah held her tight, whispering soothing words in her ear, but there was no comforting the fear that had settled deep within her. The fire was now fully raging in the kitchen, the orange glow flickering in the distance as thick black smoke poured from the open windows. Sarah had no idea how much of the house was gone, how much had been destroyed by the flames. All she knew was that she couldn't bear to watch it burn. The sight of her home, a place filled with memories, disappearing before her eyes was something she never thought she would experience. She felt a hand on her shoulder, and she looked up to see one of the neighbors, a kind woman named Linda, standing beside her. Linda had rushed over when she saw the smoke, but now she simply stood there, offering silent support. "I called the fire department," Linda said softly, her voice filled with concern. "They're on their way. It's going to be okay." Sarah nodded, though she didn't feel okay. It was hard to believe that everything would be fine. The flames were so big, and her house felt so small against them. She looked down at Whiskers, who had stopped trembling, her wide eyes now watching the fire, but with a sense of calm. Sarah felt a deep ache in her chest. She had been so focused on getting out of the house that she hadn't even realized how much Whiskers had endured too. The poor kitten must have been terrified. As Sarah sat there on the lawn, cradling Whiskers, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. Despite the fire, despite everything that had been lost, she still had her kitten. She still had Whiskers, who had unknowingly caused so much chaos, but had also managed to escape unharmed. In that moment, Sarah knew one thing for sure. Material things could be replaced, but the love she felt for Whiskers was irreplaceable. Suddenly, the sound of sirens filled the air, and Sarah looked up, her heart pounding. The fire trucks arrived, screeching to a halt as the firefighters rushed out. They immediately assessed the situation, one of them hurrying inside to tackle the growing flames, while others set up hoses to douse the fire. The whole scene was a whirlwind of activity, but in that moment, it felt like everything had slowed down. Sarah stood up, holding Whiskers carefully as she approached one of the firefighters. She needed to know if there was any hope of saving her home. "Will it be okay?" she asked, her voice shaky. The firefighter looked at her and gave a reassuring smile. "We'll do everything we can," he said, "but your kitten's safe, and that's what matters right now. We'll make sure it doesn't spread further." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she hugged Whiskers tighter. She had been so focused on getting her kitten out of the fire, she hadn't even considered what would happen to the house. But in that moment, the most important thing was that Whiskers was alive, and Sarah was too. The fire department worked quickly and efficiently, and after what felt like an eternity, they finally managed to get the fire under control. The flames died down, leaving nothing but smoldering ruins where the kitchen had once been. Sarah stared at the wreckage in disbelief. The kitchen, the heart of the house, where so many meals had been shared, where laughter and love had filled the air, was gone. But as she looked down at Whiskers, who had snuggled into her arms, she felt a warmth that was stronger than the fire ever could be. "We're okay," Sarah whispered to Whiskers, the tears now streaming down her face. "We're okay." As the firefighters finished up and began to leave, Sarah and Whiskers stood together, still holding each other. The night was quiet now, the air calm, but in Sarah's heart there was a deep sense of relief mixed with sadness. Everything could be rebuilt. The house could be repaired, and the memories of the fire would fade with time. But what would never change was the bond between Sarah and her kitten. Through the chaos, the fear, and the disaster, they had made it through together. Whiskers mewed softly, her little body now relaxed, as if understanding that everything was going to be all right. Sarah smiled through her tears, feeling a deep sense of love and gratitude for her tiny, curious kitten. What started as a playful disaster had turned into a life-changing experience, but in the end, they had both survived it. For now, that was enough.